Next up, loft apartments. So loft apartments really started in Soho, which means south of Houston Street in Manhattan. So essentially, loft apartments are just wide open spaces with really big windows. Originally, all these loft apartments were actually manufacturing spaces. As manufacturing moved out of Manhattan, these spaces were empty, and landlords didn't know what to do with them. And artists started moving in because they were like, hey, these spaces are great for making art. They're big, they're filled with light. What could be better? They're rough. I don't have to worry about keeping it clean. And so landlords were happy to have the artists come in and move in because they were at least collecting some rent on what was before just vacant and empty spaces. A lot of them were done in these beautiful old cast iron buildings which were built in the late 1800s. Cast iron was a new technology at the time, and it allowed you to make these really big windows. You could see the technology had changed, and now we have big sheets of glass, and it created these beautiful light-filled spaces. So here's a great example of one of these lofts. This is a building that was owned by the famous artist and critic Donald Judd. And you could see it's a cast iron building with these really nice big windows letting light into all these floors. So these artists moved into these spaces because these spaces became available at the same time that art and paintings were getting bigger and bigger. No longer were people just doing easel paintings. Now they were doing these big wall paintings, and these spaces were perfect for that. And so these artists started fixing all these spaces up and putting in plumbing and putting in heating. Eventually, they lobbied Albany to change the laws to allow people to live in these areas that were originally zoned for manufacturing. And you actually had to register with the state as an artist in residence to be able to live there. And then they would actually have a sign out front that said AIR, which meant artist in residence. And so the firemen would know that people were actually living there in case there was a fire in the building. All these artists made all these great living spaces, and then all these galleries moved in to show the art that these artists were creating, and it became this great, vibrant arts community. But then, as soon as that happened, people with much greater wealth started to move in and buy these lofts because they were such great spaces to live in. And eventually that pushed all the artists out, and they could no longer afford to live in these spaces. And the whole neighborhood changed almost overnight. All those galleries just got up and moved in the early 90s and went to Chelsea. And so what's left in Soho now is just a lot of really wealthy people and very fancy shops instead of the galleries and bookstores that used to be on all the streets there. So the exteriors are still intact, and they still are beautiful, filled with all these cast iron and industrial looking buildings.